Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Ryan Sage, the president of Formula Drift. For those of you who don't know, I thought we would do a little bit of kind of an organic, unique piece of content today. Last week, Formula Drift released to the public and to the teams our final rule book of the season. And it is the judging regulation. So lots of new and interesting things going on in there. And I thought it might be a good idea to kind of go through that rule book line by line and address and talk about some of the changes that we have made and that we are making, so that when you watch the show, you kind of have a better understanding of what to expect and maybe where some of that came from. And I've always personally felt that it's a little bit easier to go through and explain in language what's written in the rule book and how that applies and where that rule came from and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. So for those of you that don't know, I'm going to share my screen here. So for those of you who don't know, this is our website, and all of our rule books are down here at the bottom in the footer where it says rule book, penalties, and forms under the competition tab. You can click there, and all of the rule books for 2023 are listed. We've got the Pro-Am safety regulations, our Prospect technical regulations, our Pro regulations, and then we have our sporting regulations and our judging regulations. The differences between those two: the judging regulations are obviously what transpires in competition as it relates to judging, and sporting has to do more about with processes, you know, like what forms we need to pay your prize money and the way that the flow of information works from teams to the series and things like that. So it's a much less exciting one. Let's just say that. So I wanted to take some time and walk you through this. This is going to be a video that's more catered to like a hardcore fan. So if you are just interested in, you know, our content, but not necessarily like really into the judging side of it, just like to watch it, this might not be for you. But you know, it may also as well. It just depends on where your interest level lies. So all you have to do here, if you're a fan or anybody, is go to this page, click on the judging regulations, and it will download it. Now, the one that I have right now, I have it in draft form, but basically this is the final one. So the way that we approach rulebook writing in general is that everything that we've had from a previous season will carry over and will stay basically the same as long as it's relevant to that particular year. And then all of the new items that we put in the rulebook, because it is a pretty long rulebook, we always highlight those in a different color. And in this particular case, we highlighted in red. So if all you care about as a driver is just what's new, you can go find the red and boom, there you go. So I'm going to walk through from the very beginning. We kind of start off in provision number 1, and we talk about just generally what the sport for us is all about. The two major provisions in general that we added has to do with 2 committees that we have. One is called an in-competition committee, and another is called the out-of-competition committee. And without getting too granular, basically what those groups do is, if we find ourselves in a situation where there is something that takes place in competition that needs an answer to right now, but we don't feel we have a good relative justification for it in the rule book, this group gets together and basically says, hey, this is what we should do. This is in the spirit of the rules, blah, 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 blah. And then the outside competition committee is for things that don't need an answer in real time, but do need to be addressed in subsequent versions of the rule book or into addendums or memos and things of that nature. This rule is actually not new per se. We actually added this in Orlando last year, and we felt that we needed it. We needed to have groups that worked in various aspects of competition. So in this case, in the in-competition committee, it's myself, Pat Gentili, who is our race control, and Sean Adriano, who is our driver steward. So we have a representative from like each aspect of the business. We have executive, we have operational competition with Pat, and then we have Sean, who basically is a representative and a driver steward for the drivers themselves. So that's probably, you're never going to hear about this, but it is in there. So We talk about who the alternates are. We talk about some of the processes that pertain to it, but that's a new one in general. Probably the biggest thing that will be most noticeable to you guys this upcoming season is the way that drivers, stewards, commentators, and judges are all going to be relative to years past. So to simplify it, basically this year we're going to have what we're calling a rotational panel of judges, driver stewards, and commentators. Our driver steward is Sean Adriano. He is going to be in a fixed position as the driver steward. However, we have 4 judges this year. And since we have positions for 3 judges, there will be 1 judge that's standing on the outside. That judge for that particular round in a rotational way will be the second driver steward with Sean. Now, the primary reason for that is that the driver steward position has become a very complex and sometimes very draining position, because not only is the driver steward managing all of the internal replay mechanisms that we have for the replay machine that the judges use outside of the live stream, he's also fielding all of the protests and inquiries coming in from the teams. And so you can imagine a situation where he gets a protest, he's got to walk up, he goes outside, 15 minutes goes by, and like nobody's running the replay machine. So that's one reason for it. The other reason for it is that I feel it's really important for drivers and judges to live in each other's shoes from time to time and to try to develop greater empathy and understanding for what it's like to be a driver that has given your all at a round, and you feel like you got the short end of a stick or something like that on one category in qualifying, versus we know how painful it can be to be a position like a judge where you're pretty much nobody's friend. Nobody's congratulating you after the event. You don't stand up on the podium. It's a very thankless job, and it's very difficult to get smart, good, and honest people to be in these positions that also have the kind of the mettle and the fortitude to deal with all of the things that come about in being in a motorsport that's has a judging element to it. So our judges for this year are Ryan Lantain, Brian Eggert, Chris Ewell, and bringing back a seasoned veteran, not only as a driver, but also as a judge, in Robbie Nishida. Now that COVID has kind of fainted off into the background a little bit in terms of protocols and travel, Robbie is now available to come back. And since we like working with Ryan, Chris, and Brian, we want to also add Robbie. How do we make that work with a 3-person judging panel? Well, if we go with this new system where one of the judges is a driver steward, now we can make that happen. The other aspect is that we're going to also have a rotational panel of commentators. So it is the 20th season. It is something that we think is, kind of consistent with what we're doing with the judges. And so our commentators for this year are going to be Jared Deanda. He's a fixed commentator, just like Sean is a fixed driver steward. Myself, Robbie Nishida, and Ryan Lantain. And we will rotate different aspects of competition on any given weekend. So if you take Long Beach, for example, maybe I'll do qualifying, Robbie will do top 32, and Ryan will do top 16. One other member that we are introducing this year, specifically for Pro Spec announcing itself to work alongside Jared, is Matt Sopa. Now, Matt Sopa is a very famous, long-time supporter of the sport. He's been our start line guy for a very long time. He's an awesome dude, and he's starting to get into the announcing game a little bit. We've worked with him on some of our LA Auto Show demos, and him and I have spent some time going through what we think that position looks like, and we think it would be great to have Matt be the Pro Spec announcer with Jared. So you've got a rotational panel of judges, you've got a rotational panel of commentators, and you've got a rotational panel of driver stewards that are the judges that are not judging that round. Start line procedure is our second provision. This kind of gets into all the basics of, getting off the line and all that kind of stuff. As you've probably noticed in the sport over time, start line positioning for the cars has changed and modified as people have kind of figured out, hey, I want to take this strategy against this driver, and so I'm going to have a staggered start. We've now identified what the limits are to that. So you can't start 30 feet back. you've got to be within a certain distance to the rear wheels or the back bumper of the car in the front. So not a very significant change, but it's not nonetheless one that we have added in. You also may know that if a lead vehicle stalls at the start line, it is no longer an incomplete, it's now a strike. But that only pertains to the lead driver. It doesn't pertain to the chase. The chase has to be ready to go at any time, but we do give a little bit of latitude to the lead driver if he does stall on the line. So the biggest one, I think, is probably qualifying. This is the part of the rule book and part of the in practice elements of the competition that are going to change the most. Now, it's not necessarily that it's going to change so much that you're going to notice, say, the difference between night and day, but it's going to be significant enough to where I think if it works out, it will be easier to understand, better flow for us, and more related to the way that I think fans are actually judging individual qualifying runs. So I'm not going to get too much into how we were doing it in the past, but I'll do some parallels to that as we go through this. So we still have what's called the knockout qualifying format, which basically means we have a field of drivers. We do one lap. The first group gets essentially knocked in. The other group gets knocked out into the second run. Now, in the past, we've had this whole like bottom 8 thing. That's basically gone. The new way to do it is after the first run, it's going to be the top 24 drivers that move on. So first run goes through, you take the top 24 scores, they become drivers 1 through 24, and then 25 through 32 positions will be filled by the second run. Now, the other difference that you will experience, especially if you are a hardcore fan and have been following for, say, more than 5 or 10 years, is that we're going back to the reverse order qualifying format. So last year, and for reasons that I can get into if you want in the comment section, we started off with the #1 ranked guy, and then we moved our way down. I've never really liked that way, but there were reasons why we did it. Now it's going to switch back to the traditional way. It's going to be the last ranked driver moving all the way up to, in this case in pro, Frederick Osbo, who will be the last qualifying driver for run #1. Once the 2 runs have happened, that'll populate the top 32, and then the remaining drivers will have to go home for the weekend, but you will get your top 32 bracket filled that way. Currently in pro right now, I believe we have 39 drivers, so there's going to be possibly at least 7 per round, depending on who shows up at what rounds, that are going to be going home on any given weekend. I feel like that's like, you don't really want to go higher than that in an ideal scenario, unless people are voluntarily making that decision. It feels weird to send home, say, 15 people after qualifying. In many cases, that are going to happen on Thursday at combined weekends and stuff like that. But now getting into the nitty gritty. So line, angle, style are still the primary criteria for qualifying, along with what we introduced last year called X factors. Now I'm going to break down the way that we think about those from a definitional standpoint, but it's important to understand that the main part of qualifying that's going away for this year is that we no longer have sector scoring. Sector scoring is completely gone. We also do not have individual judges for individual criteria. We have all of the judges judging the same thing and making deductions on mistakes that were made and quantifying those deductions. So the way that I think, for example, that fans are doing qualifying at home is they're not sitting there with a scoring key going through, making their notes saying, oh, well, this sector's 1 is worth this many points, sector 2 is worth that many points, and, doing the, kind of the really detailed analysis in the way that the judges do, which is really good for drivers. I think our old qualifying system is a very driver-centric system, because almost all the questions that a driver would want to know in terms of where he got his deductions take place in what criteria and things like that. However, that key never makes it into the live broadcast. And so you can have runs that, say, for example, look dramatically different than each other, but have similar scores just because of the nature of where the deductions take place in those sectors. So we've gotten rid of that. That came about from a discussion that we had with the teams at one of our town halls where we said, look, right now our qualifying is very, very driver centric. Can we move it back to the middle so that it has some relationship to fan centricity, right? I always talk about driver centric things and fan centric things. And I think we all generally agreed that that would be okay, as long as that it was consistent with what they're used to in some sense, and that it was easy to understand. And the easy to understand part is the part that I'm really going for this year. So line, angle, style. Line is worth 40% of your score. Angle, 30% of your score. Style, 20% of your score. And X factors, 10% of your score, making up 100%. Now, for some of you, line, angle, style has always been around drifting for a long, long time. Style has always been the one to kind of pin down the most, because it's line and angle is pretty easy to define, especially it's also pretty easy to apply it to any particular run in terms of whether or not you're driving the preferred line 100% of the time or 90% of the time, whether or not you have angle that has stability and it's a large amount of angle versus a little bit amount of angle and it's not stable. Those things are pretty easy to identify, and for even a layperson coming into the sport for the very first time to kind of see, like, this guy's got low angle, this guy's not driving the right line, et cetera, et cetera. Style across the globe in different drifting organizations has meant different things. For us, it means two very specific things. It has to do with the initiation, and it has to do with the transitions. That's it. The initiation and the transitions, when you look at line and angle, are the things that are not being accounted for if you just take style to be a general category. And so what we're trying to do is to take all the things that can happen in a solo qualifying run, identify those things, and then be able to have an account for those so that drivers either get the benefit of having that analysis, or that if there's a mistake there, that they can get the deduction. And that's one of the things I think was missing in some of the previous iterations, is that there were these things like on the border that, kind of made a difference, or could make a difference, 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 points, that weren't necessarily being directly attributed to a particular category. And so we were trying very, very hard in the off season to come up with a way that we could account for all the things that could happen in qualifying, and then be able to attach point allocation to them. So the way that the process is going to work is, and this is where I think a lot of the fans at home actually do this same process. The way it's going to work is a judge is going to have a map, and they're going to have their scoring pad. They're going to see the driver go through the course, and they're going to mark mistakes or deductions, and then they're going to quantify those mistakes, right? So initiation was a little bit weak, -1, low line right here, -3, low angle here, not stable, -2, et cetera, et cetera. Then they're going to take all those deductions. They're going to take them off of line, angle, and style, right, which is a maximum of 90 points. And then they're going to add up to 10% in X factor points. Now, X factor points is something that we extracted out of style and then tried to give it a more robust definition. So if you can imagine, when you watch a driver like a Chelsea Denofa, a James Dean, a Justin Pollock, they have these points of difference between themselves and other drivers that are sometimes things that you can't necessarily put your finger on. And I would want to try to get away from not being able to put your finger on it. I want to be able to put our finger on it so that we can award them for when they do those things, for when they have really heavy and controlled throttle usage, when they drive with big angle, but they also are maintaining consistent pace, when they are snapping that transition at a very quick rate right up against the wall, as opposed to kind of a little bit more measured and slow, but still would have got really good points. It's those kind of things that on the margins make the difference in terms of a really, really high level run and a good run. And I think that those things have to be accounted for in our qualifying format. So you've got 90% of your score, allocated to line, angle, and style, and 10% of your score allocated to X factors. You go through, you make all the deductions, -2, -3, -1, -2. You take that off of 90. Let's just say it's 8. So you've got 82. And then you award those X factor points for the things that I described. And then let's just say, for example, that's 4. So you had 82 plus 4 is 86. That's your score for judge 1. Now you go to judge 2. And then judge 3. And so you've got 3 individual scores. And let's say in this case, they're 90, 89, and 87. We are now going to average those scores. So you've got a total score in that case of 88.6. This methodology is very similar to some Olympic style type scoring and also surfing scoring, where in principle, you basically have a number of judges. You take the high and the low out, and then you average the middle. So in our case, we only have 3 judges, so we're taking all 3 scores and we're averaging them. So that was a lot, so digest that. Put whatever other questions you guys have in the comment section. I'll try to answer them to the best ability, or somebody on my team will. But that's basically one of the biggest things that I think is going to be different from last year compared to this year. And I don't know if it's going to play out in a very clear way to say like a new fan that might have only watched for a couple of years. But certainly, I think because you don't have a line, angle, style judge anymore, and you have judge 1, judge 2, judge 3, that certainly is going to be a very noticeable difference. Okay, the next section, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but basically it's just breaking down the incompletes in qualifying, and as it pertains to one area that we felt really needed to have a better definition, because they have different applications in qualifying compared to tandem, and that's the definition of unchaseable lead. So the traditional definition of unchaseable lead is a mix of mistakes that could be classified as an unchaseable lead, and that would mean that if an unchaseable happened and the chase driver within proximity, the mistake from the lead would plausibly have resulted in causing the chase driver to incomplete or to make a mistake. However, in qualifying, the judges have greater latitude for that driver in a strict application of the criteria, because for us, proximity changes everything. If you don't have proximity, it's much more difficult to have a cause and effect relationship. And so in qualifying, instead of being so super strict on unchaseable leads, when we don't have a chase driver, we will give a little bit more latitude to those drivers that have a mix of multiple mistakes. Now, look, they're going to have a bad score, but we don't want to unfairly give people incompletes for things that might have resulted in, say, contact or losing angle to a chase driver if a lead driver happened to make those mistakes in tandem. We've also kind of taken another stab at more clearly defining what control across the finish line means. And we've had a number of instances last year where that came into the purview, but it's been a long time rule that we've had. It's been a rule that's advocated for by the drivers themselves, and about finishing the run with complete control, et cetera, et cetera. In 3.4, we talk about the tiebreakers. Now, when you have a system where when you mathematize things in an averaging way, you get a lot of tiebreakers if you don't have an appropriate variable in there. So in run 1, we've got 3 tiebreakers, and in run 2, we've got up to 9 tiebreakers. So going to the tandem format. So this area right here, I think, is the most important thing for me in terms of the differences between qualifying and tandem elimination format. And we have an area in the 3rd paragraph that says the following, and I'll read it verbatim. Cause and effect relationships as it pertains to drivers competing against each other is absolutely essential when a judge is trying to determine what cause each driver does to create an effect to the other driver. Contact and mistakes are all viewed through this process, especially when drivers are within proximity, and it becomes a reasonable inference for a judge to draw a conclusion using this method. An example of this that I think will be very striking is take two cars, separate them by 120 feet, 120 yards, whatever. They're not basically in a tandem situation. The guy in the front has a big heavy e-brake, slows down, decel light pops on, whatever, but then he keeps going. Now start moving that closer, start moving that closer, start moving that closer until they're here. That makes all the difference in the world. Independently, by itself, that mistake is going to be a big mistake. The moment that you have a driver within proximity, that game changes. And so whenever we are looking at what happens in tandem elimination format, we are looking to identify as best we can, was there or are there cause and effect relationships between driver A and driver B, where one of those causes can be attributed to one driver over the other. I feel like if you don't have that in the front of your mind when you're looking at tandem runs, you will go astray, because you have to be able to distinguish between cause and effect relationships that actually happen within proximity and a cause, guy way up here, that doesn't result in an effect because the guy's back here. Now, that doesn't mean this guy didn't do anything bad. It just means that there was a cause and no effect, if that makes sense. Okay. So moving along here, you can see that we no longer have a sector map in the judging rulebook because there's no sector scoring. Got our traditional map with the layouts, clip zones, et cetera, decel areas from telemetry. And that's basically kind of a much more simplified format in terms of like how many maps we're using and what they mean and all that kind of stuff. We've also updated the incomplete tandems. I won't go through all of them, but they're somewhat related even to some of the qualifying stuff. We've updated the definition for inactive chase. We've updated the mix of multiple mistakes classified as an unchaseable lead. And we've also updated the spinning over the finish line or not maintaining control. Rain conditions. So we've always had an operational structure for when rain happens. And in general, like you can drift in rain. It's not fun. It's not exciting. Maybe for some people it's exciting. For me, it's not that fun, but it definitely creates a variable that's not that great. And we can usually get through it, even if it's torrential, and as long as there's no standing water, we can get through it. However, last year we had 2 instances, so only 2 instances I've ever been involved in 20 years doing this, where both times it rained, we also had lightning strikes. So we wanted to put something in there that basically talks about what we do in rain conditions. In general, when we have rain conditions with no lightning strikes, we can keep moving forward. When we do have lightning strikes, and those lightning strikes, depending on what county you're in, are within 5 or 10 miles, not only do the fans have to leave the metal grandstands, all of the camera operators have to get down off the lifts. And that is just something that totally sucks, but it's a reality of what is required of us to do when we go to these venues. Many of you will know about the sight laps. We talk about in this provision what takes place in order for there to be a sight lap. These cars are obviously, they're so gripped up, and there's a lot of tire debris down on the course, depending on what part of competition it is. Anytime that there's even a slight change to the grip levels on a course, it's usually acceptable to give drivers a sight lap for fairness. This next part right here gets into tandem contact. Now, for those of you that are like hardcore fans, you'll know that in previous iterations of the rulebook, we had 2 definitions as it related to cars coming in contact with each other. We had contact and we had collision. And contact was just, they got contact with each other, but it did not result in an incomplete. And collision is they got contact with each other and it did result in an incomplete. So that was the 2 distinctions. In this case, what we've decided to do, and I think it's much more simple, is we've got rid of the term collision, and we've just talked about contact without an incomplete and contact with an incomplete. So we will always talk about contact. We'll just talk about what that contact ended up being, whether there was an incomplete that happened or not. So the first one is the biggest one, and it's the thing that we'll spend the most time on, I think, in explaining, is run 1 contact without an incomplete. Now, In the past, when we've had run one contact, we have to get to run two. And when we've had that contact, we have to determine who's at fault. So that person, if they need to break repairs, don't have to use their competition timeout. And what we realized when we started looking at this is that those were the ones where it was always like multiple replays. The drivers are just sitting there. Maybe they need to look at their car. Maybe they don't. And you end up adding all this unnecessary time to the show. So what's going to happen if we have run one contact without an incomplete? Both drivers are going to get an automatic 5. And there's obviously other things that play into that once you get to the end of the 5 minutes, if there's something more extreme that happens. But in general, we actually, when we did the math of it, it's faster for us to give those drivers an automatic competition timeout, a free competition timeout, and move on to the next pair that's already in the burnout box ready to go, than it is to sit there and wait and go through all these replays just to determine fault, and then only to find out that the drivers would have gone back to the line anyway. So we think that this is going to actually help with the flow of show. It also allows us to basically have much more control over the flow of the show when we have processes that just get automated. Boom, there was contact. Hey, you guys want to look at your car? Boom, automatic 5. Don't worry about it. Take your 5, take your 2 minutes, whatever it is, come back up. That next pair is already going, and we can continue to make the show move forward. The next one is run one contact with an incomplete. Now, when we have an incomplete, it's extremely important for both drivers to know who got the incomplete, because somebody has essentially a 0. So in this case, when we have run one contact with an incomplete, the judges will have to ascertain fault using all the resources at their disposal. Now, that's not too different than what we have done in the past. However, it's trying to be as clear as we can in the rule book. Run one, run two, with an incomplete, without an incomplete. What are the processes, right? So there's no confusion. Run two contact without an incomplete is basically, we don't have to really do anything, because if it's run two, the run is over, there's no incomplete. It just gets judged as part of the overall part of what took place in that run. And then run two contact with an incomplete, obviously that's going to determine the run if there was a scored run on the first run. So that obviously in the process of telling us who's at fault, that's going to also be the process by which the judges are going to be telling us who the winner is, essentially, because obviously somebody has an incomplete. The decel light. So there have been a few Instagram posts like floating around with our competition director's new decel light, which is really, really cool. And I want to do maybe a separate video on that to show you how it functions. But maybe I can highlight some of the top line points. So last year's decel light was basically an on-off switch. If you reached a certain threshold in deceleration, the light would come on. And the threshold that it's set at is a proprietary threshold that only we know. And that threshold is the latest that, or the most extreme decel that can be, or the most minor decel that can be seen by the human eye. So it's a decel that can be seen, and it's called a visual decel that hits that threshold. Then the light comes on. This year's decel light is going to have different stages for different data points coming off of the boxes. So the light's going to be 2 strips down the center, or down the A-pillars of the car, or down the windshield of the car. There's going to be 4 lights in its operation. Blue means it's neutral, means it's functioning, means we know it's working, right? Because we've had instances where things come unplugged, we find people's decel lights, not working, et cetera, et cetera. So blue is telling the judges, is telling all our staff, hey, this thing's working, okay? Green is going to be an acceleration, and it's going to be a linear acceleration, okay? So as G-force is being measured and you're accelerating, you're going to see more green. When you start decelerating, you're going to have yellow going in the other direction till the midway point. Once you get to the midway point and you get to our definition of a decel, which is a proprietary definition, boom, the whole thing turns red, Okay. So what you're probably going to see a lot of is green, yellow, red, green, stuff like that. And what that's trying to help us do is understand that there's a difference between decelerating or decelerating in a general sense and decelling on our definition, because our definition is a visual threshold, right? It's like you can still decel up to a certain point, yellow, red. And we're trying to make that distinction because obviously if it's a visual decel, the chase driver should be able to see it in the same way that the judges can see it. It doesn't make any sense for us to have a parameter that can't be seen by the human eye, right? And because we are now moving into the telemetry space, we can start thinking about those things a little bit more deeply. But at the end of the day, we do need to have a mechanism by which the judges can understand when a driver is accelerating, when they are just generally decelling versus when they're going to our definition of a decel. Okay, let's move on here. So competitions, protests, and appeals. Now that we have two driver stewards that can help us manage this, we've also kind of reworded and gone through an updated version of what a valid protest is and what the process is. So protest must be done on an action that was actually missed by the judges within the confines of a battle that would have resulted in an incomplete or an action that would have changed the outcome of the result. So for example, if a driver's trunk came up during a run and a judge did not see it, that would be an example of an incomplete or an action that would have changed the outcome of a run. The protests also have to have an action that is incontrovertible visual evidence and is not subject to a judge's opinion. So a protest is not valid if you go up and just say, look, I think I did better than him, whatever. It's got to be something that really wasn't taken into consideration and that we have visual proof for. There's three areas of protests that besides like when you have to lodge it, when you have to get it in, the forms and all that kind of stuff, but there's three areas that we focus on in protest. The first one is the protest valid. And we use a traditional definition of validity here from, say, logic, for example. So validity asks the question, would the action in question have resulted in an incomplete or changed the result to the driver being protested? In that case, it basically means, are the premises true, right? And then is the protest sound? And we also use a pretty traditional definition of soundness. And that means that the claims themselves are incontrovertibly true. So you've got validity in the form and you've got soundness in the truth. And then the final part is the adjudication. Now, this is really where the new driver stewards are going to come into play, because the way that a protest gets adjudicated now is different than how it had last year. Last year, what would happen is protests would come in from Sean. He would go and say, hey, guys, to the judges or whatever, this is the protest. What do you guys think? Here's the footage that I pulled up, blah, 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 blah. And they would either overturn it or approve it. And we've had both instances. In this case, we're taking the judges out of it completely, not only for political reasons, but also because it's for, the flow of the show reasons, right? And the driver stewards will get a protest in. Let's just say they think that it's valid and sound, and now they have to make a decision. So driver steward Sean and driver steward, say, Robbie, for example, will come up with an arbitration of how to do the process and subsequent decision. They must agree on what that process is. They are allowed to ask the judges for their opinion. They are allowed to ask the judges for their input. But at the end of the day, those two stewards have to agree. Now, we are giving them latitude that it could be whatever the decision could be whatever they want it to be. Maybe it is overturning the run like it has in the past. Maybe it is rerunning the second half of the run because that's where the incident took place. Or maybe it was modifying the call altogether in some way that they think makes sense. We're allowing them that flexibility and freedom so that they can make the best possible decision. But they do have to agree. That's the main part of it. Okay, we're making our way through. So that's protests in a nutshell. This language pretty much has been reviewed by everybody, but most importantly, it's been approved by our driver steward, who's going to be handling all of that. So we're getting towards the end here. Now we're basically in the glossary. So all of the new terms that we've added into the rule book always have a referent in the glossary. So you can see that first one, adjudication, that's a new term, right? So we've got a definition for that. Inactive chase, new definition. Incomplete, new definition. All of these things have a corresponding definition in the actual glossary itself. And then we also have a copy of a protest form that can be printed out. We've got the bracket here, and then we also have judging examples of the way that judges look at specific things in terms of taking notes and trying to keep a record or have record keeping of what transpires in the battles themselves. And that's pretty much it. That's the big stuff. So feel free to comment down below. Either myself or somebody on our staff can answer as many questions that you guys have. If you like this video, cool, we can keep doing more stuff like this. We've also got a lot of really cool stuff coming up with other like internal inside baseball type stuff here shortly. So I'm really excited. Other than that, appreciate you guys watching, and have a good one.